I'm Lee Gallagher, Assistant Managing Editor of Fortune Magazine, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Not only because Dom is the only person in business with whom I can wear these high heels. Anyway, we're here today for the Council on Foreign Relations CEO Speaker Series with Dominic Barton, Global Managing Director of McKinsey & Company. The purpose of the CEO Speaker Series, as many of you know, is to host leading global CEOs to share their insights on issues that are at the center of both foreign policy and commerce, and to talk about the changing role of business in the international community. And we have with us a fantastic speaker to do exactly that. I met Dom for the first time this past November at our Fortune Global Forum in San Francisco, where he spoke to our audience of CEOs about leadership in a disruptive time in a disruptive place, and about opportunities in emerging markets, two topics he has keen insights on. But here's the thing about Dom. As Global Managing Director of McKinsey, which is basically CEO of McKinsey, he and his firm advise a majority of the Fortune 500. Is that fair to say? You can't say.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
A lot of companies. And Dom has been at the firm for 29 years, 30 this July. So he's deeply involved with many of them. And Dom himself has a rule that he has meetings with 2 CEOs or global government leaders a day. So when you talk to Dom, you're not only getting his insight and analysis and perspective, you are getting it filtered through all these people he's constantly talking to. So it's not only always interesting to talk with Dom, it is very, very efficient. So anyway, I'm really, really happy to talk to you today. There are many things I could talk with Dom about, but we're really going to be focusing today on human security in conflict zones. Now, that may sound like an unusual topic for a business panel, and it certainly is. Specifically, we're going to talk about how business, government, the social sector, and the US military can work to improve human security in conflict zones globally. Obviously, it's a topic with tremendous weight and tremendous urgency given what's going on in the world right now, from Syria, the various crisis zones throughout the Middle East, what happened in Turkey this morning, the threat from ISIS, the migrant crisis in Europe. This is a huge, enormous topic, but it's also an area where McKinsey is increasingly active. So Dom, welcome. We're going to talk for about a half hour, and then we're going to open it up to questions. But first, maybe we can just start with this. Why is human security an increasing area of focus for McKinsey? When did it become so, and what prompted it?
Well, thank you, and it's wonderful to be here at CFR. This really, I think, has become a more prominent issue because there are so many zones of conflict, if you will. I think the CFR has identified 17 of them, and they seem to be increasing. I think we have now 60 million migrants in the world. That's higher than it was in World War II. So we have a lot of conflict and hot zones, I think more so than we've seen again since World War II. And I don't think it's going to get better in the short term. And so as a business leader, I don't think you can ignore that because it does affect what you do. It's not an exogenous factor that you can ignore. I think every business leader now worries about it, whether or not they're operating in Pakistan or Northern Africa or wherever. It's an issue that's going to affect you. And I think, so that's one, it's a prevalent issue in our time. And I think business leaders there's a role to play, and I'll get back to that in a second. The second is I think you're seeing an increasing interest in government to get business help, and increasing help from the military to get business help, if you will, on it. And I personally got involved in this. It was actually Bart Friedman, who's a core member here in CFR, who got me going. It was through Brookings, and it was work they were doing in the post-Iraq conflict. Notion of how do we think about post-conflict, ensuring that you're not going to get conflict happening again, and what is it that the business and the military can do. But where it really came to a head for me was in the UK, and the British Army is basically of the view that now to be able to think about conflict, we need to have business, and particularly business, more so than even government, involved in preventing it, but also in the post period. And how do we work more systematically together to make things happen? And so we started to get a group of executives together with the senior military leaders in the UK, talking about conflict zones and what are things we could do. Northern Nigeria, I didn't realize this, one of the largest prison populations in the UK comes from Nigeria. They're Nigerians people don't know that. And so it just was an example of a conflict or issue that occurs there is going to affect the UK in a significant way. They would have to be involved, probably militarily, if something fell apart. And you actually have quite a lot of British businesses that were involved in that too. Standard Chartered Bank. You had some of the food companies. Syngenta is not a British company, but the chairman happened to be British at the time and so forth. So there was a interest in saying, are there things that we could be doing to provide? And then you had DFID, which was the aid agency doing things, but it's not joined up. So I think a long-winded way of saying, I think there's all the different, I call it the tri-sector world. You've got government, you've got the private sector, and the NGOs. Those are the tri-sectors have to work together more. And I think from each of those areas, they're saying we need the other to help. And I think again, I personally think, shut up here, one of the biggest sources of conflict is lack of employment. It's no jobs for people. That's one of the biggest challenges. And so I don't think a government can create those jobs. Businesses need to create those jobs, but they're not going to create the jobs if there's not a viable business and if there's not security. So I think that's where it's in all of our interest to, create jobs that are viable in these hotspots. And I personally think a lot of the challenges that we're seeing from Syria and what we're seeing in Jordan, and as it then spreads coming into Europe, what we're seeing in Kenya. I worry a lot about Kenya because you've got people now, tourism is down. A lot of people are afraid to be tourists there, if you will. And I remember the Kenyan president telling me once, he said, those 9-year-olds that sell you trinkets on the beach when you're there, well, that's 60% of their family's income. And if there's no more tourists coming to buy those trinkets, and then someone comes along and says, I'll give you $100 if you hide this particular thing in your home, they're going to take it because they're hungry. And he goes, we can't stop that. And so these ability to create jobs, to create the stability, I think is critical. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better unless we do something together.
And are you mostly talking to corporations that are already operating in these zones, in these regions, and just listen, you really have to focus on this more, you have to work with these 2 other sectors, 3 other sectors, or are you talking to other businesses and saying, listen, we need to build economies in these places, you need to go in there? So is it existing businesses or is it bringing new players in?
It's a bit of both. So in northern Nigeria, which is quite a dangerous spot, you've got the Gates Foundation, which is doing incredible work on health, right? Just getting rid of polio. They're doing brave people as well that are in there doing it. You've got it's an agricultural place, and Paul would know much more about these. Nigeria has the potential to be a significant agricultural player. There's a lot of good opportunity, but the farmers there are afraid to be able, they're threatened by people. It's hard for them to be able to not only produce crops, but if they have them, to actually transport them to places. But there are actually businesses that are there that want to do more. You've got Woolworths. These are mainly African retail players that are there looking to either source food or do things on that front. And then we've had banks, some Standard Chartered Bank, others that want to do actual business there, but they're not joined up, if you will. And that's the thing of how is there. And then you need the military, you need the security because it's too terrifying to be in the place. So there are businesses there. There've been other places where it's getting people together. So getting Vodafone. Thinking about the auto industry, thinking about players that are basically able to create jobs, support a supply industry, SMEs and so forth, that are actually saying, where is it that we could go to help? There may be opportunities to do it. So that's sort of the mix.
And when it comes to what the private sector can do in places like this, are we talking largely, it sounds like it's a combination, but is it the Siemens, the IBM, the enormous companies, the Vodafones, or is it local seeding entrepreneurism on the ground, which can be so powerful in terms of really developing an economy from the ground up? Or is it a combination of both? And do those two entities have to work together?
It's both, and I also don't want to exaggerate. It's not as though there's like 25 examples. I think this is early, it's early days, right? And again, we're seeing it, it's in the hot spots. One of the other trips we did, which was a bit of, I didn't tell anyone at McKinsey I was going, we took a group of 6 CEOs to Afghanistan. And it was a range, it was a mining company, which was it was Rio Tinto. It was basically it was a Hong Kong conglomerate, basically, that had interests in everything from food to financial services. It was a small business leader from the UK who'd done work in sort of the Silk Roads in that region, mainly in the trade, like low-key manufacturing, food, some retail, and then there was a banker that came as well. And what was interesting there is, even in Afghanistan, as tense as a place it is, in the northern part there were actually opportunities. And then it was meeting with the Chamber of Commerce. It was literally like being in my view, St. Paul, Minnesota. I mean, you had a group of people that got together. These were Afghani business people trying to get things done. They didn't know how to be able to trade. There was a railroad that had been broken for a while. They were trying to figure out how to fix it. So the group just started to work. It's not going to change the world, but there was actually investments that were made and linkages that were made with people. So I think it's a combination of large and small.
And is the driving force, is it capitalism? There's a huge opportunity here if you get in. Is it moral obligation? Is it let's grow these economies so that this doesn't happen again? As you said, this is the single largest factor leading to disaffected youth and such.
I think the first part was honestly just curiosity. I don't think any of those people going to Afghanistan were thinking this was let's get in early and sort of figure out how we're going to make it work, sort of, right? But it was more, is there a way we could help? But I think people want to make it sustainable, and that's where I think people are saying, well, what is it that we could do that will be sustainable in some of the places that are there? And there may be some that are more challenging. One where I think there is sustainability is actually this is something that John Kerry got moving. Tony Blair had been involved with the quartet, but it was really John Kerry and Tim Collins from Ripplewood played a big role. This is sort of Palestinian business leaders and Israeli business leaders trying to create jobs and businesses in Palestine. And they've created a fund of about $1 billion that's investing in entrepreneurs. It's actually run by one of our former colleagues, Kito DeBoer, who's basically moved to Jerusalem and is based there. But they're investing, and again, these are very small businesses that they're building. What I found most exciting is you have literally Israeli business leaders, investors sitting beside Palestinian business leaders and investors around the table trying to sort this issue while all these things are going on. And so that's I think that's going to be more viable. One, it won't be big business, but it's really providing investment capital, if you will, and the sophistication of how to help these businesses start up. But that's, I think that with the view that will help with stability and with jobs, and what they're finding there is there's all sorts of regulatory issues that have to be dealt with too, about how to move products through it. So again, I think it's early days, but I think there's increasing interest and ways to figure out how we do it.
What are some of the ways around some of the hurdles in going to some of these areas, whether it's regulatory, as you mentioned, or simply logistics? A lot of services aren't up and running. Oftentimes there's corruption. There's so many kind of roadblocks for business to operate in these areas. So what's the key to kind of getting around them?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues is actually just having the people that want to do it in your organization, because they're not vacation spots, right, if you will, that people are going to. But I think when you can adapt, so the shortage is actually the people who will do it. And then again, if there's really a viable business, if you will. I happen to think in a lot of, if you think about Kenya and Somalia and what's happening there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built. It's getting the roads, the railroads, the power, and that's where some big larger organizations like GE can play a role, because it's once you get that transportation system or the power systems in place, you can do it, and it's in their interest to want to do it. And there it's a matter more of getting everyone lined up, because there is actually the desire to invest, but then it may not be the first priority for what the government's doing. So it's making sure that that's, lined up, and then when other businesses see that that's happening, how can they come in? So it's getting groups of people together. We're doing I think it's the week after next. Penny Pritzker is taking a group through. We're going to Nigeria and to Rwanda, and the plan basically is to talk about investment projects and what are ways to try and be able to get a critical mass of people. And it's some large institutions and some very small SMEs that are coming from the U.S. to meet again with local players to see what are ways that they can be able to make things happen. And the view is hopefully that with the Secretary of Commerce there, that helps de-bottleneck some of the issues in some of the particular opportunities. So this is also where, again, you get government, business. It's for capitalism, and it's not aid, but it's also got a broader benefit, I think, in what's happening.
What about the tech sector? I want to ask you about the tech sector, because there's so much, talk about what Google's doing, delivering Wi-Fi balloons all over the world so everyone can have internet access, or Facebook doing some of the same. Even something like M-Pesa, reducing the cost of banking. Certainly mobile phones have changed the lives of people everywhere. What are the opportunities for the tech sector, the tech giants, and what are the limitations?
Well, I think I'm very bullish, if you will, on the benefit that tech will provide for bringing more people into the workforce, if you will, into society, into playing a role. And the model for me, and I look at that, is actually in China with what Alibaba has done, and there's many others now, Tencent. But if you look at what Alibaba did, was basically allow tens of millions of small, medium-sized enterprises to become part of a market, right? So you can be in some tiny place in a particular part of China, and you can participate in that market. So that technology allowed tens of millions of small entrepreneurs and businesses to be able to exist in a way. And so I think that's been incredible. And by the way, also get access to finance. This was about 4 years ago. People realized Alibaba, Jack Ma would say, but I'm actually a bank. He didn't have a license, and he said, I lend anywhere from $10 to $1,000 to our customers, and I'm able to do it at a much lower cost than a bank does, because I have more data, and I also have a little bit more of a powerful, enforcing mechanism, which is if you don't pay it back at the end of the day, I'll shut you off our system. You won't be able to play on our system. And they built up a very significant loan book. Then when they're to deposits, they got into issues, but they went in. Financial inclusion actually increased significantly through technology. And you said M-Pesa. There's a number of banks in Africa that are doing phenomenal things. Sort of Equity Bank, which is a Kenyan bank. It started as a financial inclusion, very low micro loans, and what the CEO discovered is that, mainly to agricultural customers, is the reason why people didn't pay was not because they were, I'm generalizing here a bit, but the reason why they didn't pay was not because they were, bad people or it was because they were sick. Someone was sick in the family. It was typically, and they couldn't work. And so he decided to provide an insurance product, and then was able to, he's now built this thing into a very significant business, which is growing. It's got big ambition, and he's using tech. The only way he can work in those markets is through an extremely low-cost distribution system, which is technology. So I think it'll help allow more people to come in. The challenge is jobs, right? That the number of, will the same number of jobs be required in some of the manufacturing side? And I don't, that's going to be a challenge. But I think it's going to help get more people to participate.
Yeah, we have that question here as well.
Yeah.
In terms of conflict zones specifically, when is the best time for the private sector to really double down and go in? Obviously, you want to be there before, great jobs, so there is no conflict. But that aside, when is the opportunity there? I mean, I don't think maybe you can tell me I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone is pouring into Syria right now. I mean, when, what is the bell curve? When is the optimal time to go in, either private sector alone or with those partners as you talked about?
Well, I think what the military, I don't want to speak on behalf of militaries, but certainly in the UK, and I think with also the US military, is that part of the plan, if you will, has to start including what is the private sector, whether it's probably more local than it is foreign. How are you going to ensure that that is in place even before the conflict begins? Before as this Nick Parker, before the bayonets go, you need to know what is it that you're going to do afterwards, and how is that going to come together and make that part of the plan. And I actually participated in one plan. This is again more in the UK, where they do these. They're literally 2-week exercises. One of them was actually with Azerbaijan. It was sort of the case study was Azerbaijan has been taken over by Iran, and there's a NATO force. It's this like war game. You go in, there's blue teams and red teams. But what was interesting is there were business people there to say, okay, what are the things that are going to need to be done to ensure that people will actually start to invest and do things again. These weren't big companies. It was just entrepreneurs to see what are the conditions you have to have in place. So I think it has to be part of the plan. And then obviously I think it's very difficult to go in while a conflict is occurring. But what you'd be surprised at is the resilience of local entrepreneurs and what they can do. Again, in Afghanistan, I was shocked at the activity that was going on. It honestly felt like being at a local chamber of commerce in the U.S. or something. I mean, with a lot of things that were going on. People were there trying to, build businesses and sell their products, and talking about talent problems and all this sort of stuff.
Wow. So with the refugee crisis that we're seeing right now, has the private sector, have you had conversations about, McKinsey's the problem solver. So how do you think about the private sector in solving a problem like that? What are the opportunities? What are the ways?
Well, we are involved in that. Not as many people being involved in it. One way we've been involved is actually when the refugees come into the country. So it's public knowledge, we're working with the German government because they just can't simply absorb the number of people that are coming in. It's just they don't have the processes. So it's almost lean operations are what are required to be able to just absorb people and make sure people are screened properly. They're given the proper places that they can go and so forth. But I think what we're also working on with others, actually Mercy Corps is involved in this in a very good way. The IRC, David Miliband, who's here in New York, is looking at where do we think the flows are moving. So our Global Institute's actually taking a look at where do we think migrant flows will be over the next 10 years. Because and what is it that you can then do to deal with at the source to prevent, if you will, not to block, it's more to stop people wanting to have to move and see it. So it's getting a strong sense of where do we think this migrant flow is going to increase or move to. And it's not just in Syria, which we're looking at in particular, but it's also Southeast Asia. I mean, Myanmar, there's a lot of terrible, sad things that are going on in the South China Sea with the migrants. I mean, Australia has been getting a lot of that effect. We think that will increase. And again, it's not driven so much by conflict, though that's been part of it in Myanmar with some of the rebels. It's actually been, again, lack of jobs, no opportunity. So groups of young people just betting on it to move, to find opportunity. So we're trying to map that to get a better sense of it. And then also, around these refugee camps you mentioned, there's some very significant ones in Jordan, 80,000 to 150,000 people. They're cities. There's a big one in, we were talking about this before the session, I don't remember where Anna is, I can't remember the name of it. It's in Kenya, Al Sabab, I can't remember. It's a 300, do you guys know that one? It's 300,000 people that are there, and it's been there for so long that there are now grandchildren that are being born from original refs. So this is a city.
And you've done a lot of work around this, around conflict reconstruction, which is a whole other thing.
And also just, these places need mayors, right? You got to have a mayor, you got to have a police force, you've got to have hospitals. You need to have this because they're just so large. And that's another, I think again, that a lot of the flow is not, there's a fundamental reason for why it's happening that we need to look at and predict what it'll look like. But then there's these blockages, and I'd say again, these refugee camps simply can't take any more people. They have to move on. So how can we make those work more effectively? David Cameron's doing a big push right now to say, how can we, and this is again leveraging business, how can we have business be able to, if they will, buy more product, more of the food product from these parts of the world? Will that help create the jobs? These are just ideas, they're not nailed down.
Yeah, there was something I read in McKinsey paper, even the military purchasing power. There was, some of this can be as simple as the military purchasing, channeling spending to local businesses. Somebody wrote that more than 9 years after the intervention in Afghanistan began, you could still find pallets of bottled water imported from the UAE on a U.S. base that's within a few miles of 3 local Afghan water bottling plants whose owners would welcome those contracts. So, that's again getting back to the notion of working together with the sectors. While I have you here, we're going to open it up for questions in a couple minutes, but I did just want to get your take on a couple big topics in the news. We're just going to switch gears a little bit. You're going to China today. Dom's going to China today at 3 o'clock. What are we to take from what happened last week in the markets? Talk to us about the market malfunction, but also the economy story, which is they're not the same. Should we be worried about either one?
I just preface it by saying again, I'm a bull on China, which maybe again, as I said, I've probably drank the Kool-Aid there for too long. So that's my, and I'll tell you why I feel that way. But that said, I think what we're seeing with the markets, first of all, I'd look at the markets not as a regular market as we see it. It's a casino. I mean, it's mainly retail investors that are going. If you ever see a picture, if you ever go to there's actually in Shanghai, it's amazing to see people sitting around. It's almost like going to a cinema, and people are betting, and so it's not a very, it's not an institutionally driven market. And so that's another factor, and it's been moving up and down. Someone actually said that now, and I don't want to predict that valuations are now getting reasonable. Because if you recall, last June, it had just been through a massive boom. I think it had been up 180%. So you have, first of all, that market it's an indicator, but I think it's not a very good indicator because it's a casino, it's retail players. It's also been, unfortunately, I think, badly managed. I think this is an area, what's been a bit surprising to me is you've got an amazing central banker, you've got an amazing finance, it's a deep technocratic group, but in the markets, it's bad, it's not being done well. I mean, there's no other way of getting around that to say it. It's just, and I think that's where there's an opportunity to learn. I think what it's going to lead to is much more interest on China's part in having the big institutional players coming in to the place. State Street, Vanguard, BlackRock. They need it because we got to institutionalize the market more. So I think it's going to actually spur change. So that's my view is I wouldn't look at what's happening in the market there as an indicator of the strength or weakness of the Chinese economy. What I would look at more is what's happening in the private sector in China. We don't talk a lot about that. The Chinese private sector, and I don't want to say it's for every sector because it does vary in some areas. Steel is a disaster, there's overcapacity and so forth. But if you look at services, if in financial services, retail, consumer, it's booming. It's booming. I don't know how to describe it in terms of the numerics, but if you look at some of the fastest growing companies on the planet today are these, and they're mainly Chinese privately owned services and consumer goods companies that are there. The SOE sector is a different one, and that's I think the anti-corrupt state-owned enterprises, that sector is in difficulty. There is a lot of restructuring that's required, and I think this anti-corruption drive, which is it's a very good thing to do, it has led to a freezing of change in the SOEs because SOE CEOs and chairpersons are afraid to make restructuring because it's a bit like the old Red Guard. If I see David Hunt, he's running an SOE and and he has, and I don't like the restructuring he's doing, I can just send a letter in to Wang Xishang, who's the head of, he's on the standing committee, and say, I saw David had this amazing bottle of wine with some people. I don't really know what he's up to, but you might want to check it out. And then he gets an investigation. He gets a 100 questionnaire thing, which has some very deeply personal questions too on it, and you cannot lie on those. And so it's almost like it's not what you're accused of, it's what you say, where a lot of people are being picked up. So people are not doing restructuring. They're nervous about being called on, and they also cap the compensation of these SOE leaders, right? The ratio, I think, can not be more than 6 to 1. I may not have it exactly right. So it's people are going, why am I going to? So that the SOE sector is frozen, and that's a worry because it needs restructuring. The private sector is booming. Infrastructure is moving on. And again, my fundamental view is I look at China is 54% urbanized. It's every year we're seeing 25 million people move from rural areas to cities. That's what's growing the middle class that's there. It's very much in the interior. And there's the opportunity, and we see again the private people doing it. I don't think growth will be 8%. My own sense is growth is somewhere between 6 to 6.5%, but I think it's real. It's just going to be, it's a different type of growth. It's more, again, consumer services as opposed to the manufacturing. Does that?
Yeah, great. Yeah. So I think we'd like to open it up. At this time, I'd love to invite our members to join in the conversation with their questions. A couple reminders, this meeting is on the record. Please wait for the mic and speak directly into it. Please stand and then state your name and affiliation. And please limit yourself to one question and keep it concise to allow as many people as possible to ask questions. That said, do we have any questions? Here we go. Yeah.
Thank you. Earl Carr representing Momentum Advisors, and I had the pleasure of working for McKinsey in the Shanghai office. You were talking about China, and you talked about the importance of services and how they were growing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the significant amount of corporate debt in China, and if you saw that as a concern and how that is impacting the Chinese economy.
Yeah, there is a significant amount of debt. I mean, and our Global Institute has been looking at that. But the area where the debt is most significant is in the SOEs and also with the municipalities. There's not a municipal bond market, right? So a lot of the cities have to raise money by selling real estate. That's kind of and that's why you get these cycles that are moving through. And I think that the restructuring of the debt at the municipal level, I think, is going to be one of the most significant things that's required. If you actually, though, look at their, the foreign reserves that they've got, it's I can't remember what the number is, even with exports not being anywhere near they were in the trillions of dollars. But also, I think we underestimate the impact of oil. China is an oil importer, as you know, and so basically when oil went from $80 to $60, that paid for the Asian infrastructure, investment bank, the BRIC Bank, all these big investments that they were making were just because of what's happening with oil. And who knows whether that's sustainable or not, or where that's going to be, but they've been getting a lot of benefit, if you will, from the commodity price decline in where it is, particularly oil. So it's, the debt, I would argue, it is significant, large, under-recognized, if you will, but primarily I would argue at the city level. At the national level, it's not. I'm not worried about it. There's pension issues with an aging population that we need to worry about because that's not well developed. So I worry about that liability, if you will. It could be coming down the line. I don't know if we would consider that a debt, but it's a problem. The only thing I would say is you have a very deep technocratic group of leaders, right, that are looking at this. They're not aware of the debt issue and how they're moving. They're not aware of the municipal challenges. The question is how do we get these experiments, which is what they're trying to fix it, to be able to then replicate it across other places. That's what's being worked on. And the other thing I would just say is, again, at the risk of taking the Kool-Aid too much, I think the Xi Jinping is someone who I personally think is looking at, his legacy, if you will, at sort of Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Xi. And it's a 30-year, he has a 30-year horizon, even though he will only officially be in power for 8 years, because of the role that former presidents play in the group, I think he's thinking of a long game. And so he's totally comfortable doing the restructuring now, no matter what it does because he's playing a longer game. That's a feeling. I haven't talked to him, he's not told me that or anything, but that's my sense is that he's playing a long game. So he's doing he knows what this anti-corruption drive is doing to growth. Some people have say the SOE challenge is taking a 1 percentage point drop on GDP because of what's happening. But he's comfortable with that because we got to get it. He's going to consolidate power. He's got to reform the party. He's doing a lot of things now because he has a longer view. So I think that's a mind, which is very different than what we have with a lot of our political leaders, right, in terms of how we think about it.
Yes, right here.
Thank you. Dom, first, congratulations on the work you're doing. In typical McKinsey style, you're doing it low-key, no ego, selfless. The McKinsey name isn't all over the place. And, of course, you got that from your mentor, Ron Daniel. But it's great to see in a world filled with egos today the kind of work you guys are doing. So my question is...
Paul, can you just introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Paul Freeborg with Continental Grain. So my question is, McKinsey is known around the world. It's probably the best firm at hiring and training great talent. And could you take that knowledge and set up some kind of an international organization that could go to these underdeveloped countries and help select the best and the brightest, set up programs to train and develop future leaders, whether they're business leaders or political leaders, and jumpstart the process locally by bringing the best and the brightest in key positions. Yesterday there was an article about the Steve Schwarzman scholars in China, but if you could, with your knowledge at McKinsey of how to do this, how to select the best people, how to put training programs together, not done by McKinsey, but with your knowledge and know-how, could that make a difference in these countries to take that young generation and give them a chance?
Well, thank you, Paul, for your comment. I mean, I do think there's more, and this is where, for example, one of the things we struggle with in McKinsey is innovating. We're a very conservative place, and so we've been trying to do things differently. And one of the ideas we have an Africa practice saying, that maybe one of the best things we could do there, even from a client service point of view, is to establish a leadership school, but more like a business school, because that would move it. And if to your point, when we opened up our office in Kenya, I remember the Kenyan president was not, frankly, so much excited as disappointed that we were going to help the companies and so forth. As he said, many people will then join McKinsey and leave, and they'll help do things for us. That's what we see as the benefit, frankly, not what you do. So I think it's a very good push. And I do, one thing we talked about before, we have a effort going on, we're calling it Generation, which is to try and create it's sort of jobs for people. And we've taken, in about 6 countries, we take people who just have high school education and put them in a 6-week program in an area where jobs are required. So it's, for example, healthcare services is a big one. We're doing one in Pittsburgh, but in Nairobi, where we're doing a lot of this work. It's actually around, it's retail, it's logistics. And in 6 weeks, you can train people who are able to then be job ready, and then employers like it because they actually stay longer. And it's not learning the hard skills; it's the soft skills. So I think there's a lot. You're right; it's a good push. There's a lot more we could do, and I think other organizations as well, as you said, because that's the gap. One experiment we're thinking about doing is in Myanmar. There aren't enough businesses of size for us to be able to work there. So an experiment that we're going to take is to take 10 of our young people, we call it third-year business analysts, to go. They're very talented people, to basically go there and build a business. McKinsey doesn't own businesses, but to build it, and then it would have to be sold or taken over by a business that's actually there. Because the challenge is there's not enough entrepreneurs, if you or sort of people that want to build it. So we're looking at one in actually healthcare services. Anyhow, I'm just ruminating on what you're saying. I think there's a lot of opportunity.
I'll just add quickly, the countries you're in with the Generation Initiative,
Yeah.
it's USA, Mexico, Kenya, Spain, India, is that right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Okay. We have a question right here.
Thank you very much, Mahesh Kotecha. I'm actually in finance, but I've been reading a book about the city you mentioned, Dadaab, in the border of Ethiopia, of Somalia and Kenya. It's the largest refugee camp. And you mentioned 60 million displaced people in conflict zones. My question to you is, have you looked at supporting efforts to take care of and resettle people such as this, who very often became political football between the conflicting parties, such as you see currently in Syria, that conflicting the protagonists or the antagonists are using people as killing them, essentially, keeping supplies from going there. How do you help these new cities that are coming up, that are settlements, that are temporary settlements, to become more effective, more efficient, and be less politically hostage to the parties that are contending for power around them?
Well, we're doing some things. There's others, again, like Mercy Corps, the IRC, and others. Actually, the IMF, Christine Lagarde, is also someone looking at this in a significant way, so I don't want to overplay what we're doing. But what we found is that there's a lot of, if I could call it, bureaucracy that's required to get it to work. So even just having a mayor, it's not that the one in particular in Jordan we've looked at, there's no, you have to you actually need a mayor to be able to get it to operate. Then you need the departments to be able to move forward. And we had one request, which was to actually, from Christine Lagarde, said, why doesn't someone go and become a mayor? To get a person, one of your partners, they should go and do that. I don't know if we'd be qualified, but I think there are ways to be able to find people. What we focused on are pieces of it. So providing like the education requirements in some of these places, and I don't know enough detail about the one in Kenya, but I do know of a couple in Jordan. I mean, you need to develop a school system, right? And this is where I think the private sector can play a role. And where we're trying to play a role is, how do we provide good K-12 education for these kids who are there basically doing nothing? There's nothing that's provided. What curriculum do you put in place? Where do you find the teachers? How do you train them? That's needed for healthcare. It's needed for police. And so what we've been focusing more is on those capabilities as opposed to the overall leadership. But I think there's a need for overall, if you will, leadership. And there's a lot of people that I think could play a role in that. Because I agree, I think it's there's a gang violence in these refugee camps, which actually is not even related to factions, if you will, of political. It's just what happens in a city that's not managed well.
Right here.
Thank you, Merritt Jano at Columbia University. I guess the obvious question is, how are you partnering with the great universities of the world that have so many faculty who are working on just these same issues?
We could do way more. The one we have been, and that's more from the UK, as I've been primarily based in the UK. I've just moved to New York, but it was actually with the Blavatnik School in Oxford. Nari Woods has been very much part of the program, because there's a sense of, there's a lot of great research, thinking, experience that can be tapped into, but it's also a great meeting ground, if you will, to get people together. So convening people through the universities has actually been a very helpful part of it. And the universities are more long-term in a way too in the programs. One of the conflicts has been, sometimes there's been, if people want to do research as much, so it's more about the research as opposed to what I'd say the immediate here and now. That's where there's some conflicts at times. Like, let's just get going. We're saying, well, we're not sure if this really fits our research agenda or the qualifications of where it is. But I think universities are definitely a big part, and haven't been tapped into enough, because there are people working on it.
We have a question over here. I'm going to shift so I don't ignore this side of the room.
Hi, Rob Radke with Episcopal Relief and Development. I'm interested to understand how McKinsey or how you calculate the impact of climate change on refugee migration flows and as underlying causes of some of these conflicts.
We haven't done any specific sort of calculation, but it definitely, I think, is a driver of it. One of the, and I say this with ignorance, but it was just a comment I heard from one of the people that we're working with in the Jordanian refugee camp. The argument was that actually the instigation of the Syrian crisis, you could argue, was climate change, because what you had was a drought, a significant drought occurring in the agricultural areas. There was a very significant migration of people from the agricultural areas to the cities. There then wasn't, when the drought went away, there weren't enough workers to deal with. So you had food price inflation, and that, because what this person basically said was, and I forget, I know this is on the record, what he said, I'm going to say it this way, was Assad has always not been a bad guy, if you will. So why did it boil up now? He would argue it's because of, it was the sort of the trigger was that. So I do think, droughts and lack of water, these things cause crises. One other comment I'll just make on it, I've mentioned it here in this session, we were involved in the stimulation program that China put in place in 2009. Right? We were given a very tiny sliver. I kept saying in a McKinsey way, we need to see the whole picture. You can't, and he said, it's none of your business. And our job was to figure out whether you could sell more televisions by cutting the price by 25%. And these were just in tier 3 and tier 4 cities, so it was quite a focused thing. Do you cut the price by 25%, keep the price the same, and then the person goes to the mayor's office and gets a 25% refund? That was the very specific, and I kept saying, look, we need to see the whole picture. The guy says, none of your business. Do it. And so we did the work. I was all excited. I actually went to present this to the NDRC, and I said, the answer in this is you keep the price the same, and people go to the mayor's office because they feel like they're being given 25, and they'll spend more. And we went through it. We were all excited. And I said, now can you tell us and they said, no, you're not going to tell you anything about that. And then he looked at me, and I'll never forget it, and he goes, have you studied Chinese history? Because I said, I'm worried about, if the consumer class doesn't keep consuming, we're going to have a crisis in China. And he goes, have you really studied Chinese history? And I said, I think I know a little bit. And he goes, I don't think you do. Because if you did, you'd notice that all of our crises in our 5,000 years occurred because of food price inflation. And whenever food prices go over, I'll never forget it, you said, I don't know why you said it, 14%, you will have a crisis because you can't control hungry people, no matter what guns you have. And that's always registered in my mind about when I think of the importance of food security, and that's just so vital. So again, it's a long-winded way of saying I do think it's a factor, and I think in many, again, North Africa, Mali, I don't think that is driven by climate change so much as just as religious, political challenges that are going on. But I think it's a factor that we're feeling the effect of.
Fascinating. Right here.
George Rupp, Columbia and International Rescue Committee. You've mentioned a number of long-term camps and focused in particular on the requirement for education. The International Rescue Committee has been involved in every camp you've mentioned, and including Dadaab, and we do have educational programs there. There's a major variable that has to do whether there are good educational programs or health programs or others or aren't. And that's whether the funding targets that the UN sets are met. One of the reasons for the tragedy in the camps that are housing Syrians who fled to Jordan as well as other neighbors is that funding has simply not been met. So the UN has 10% of its requested funds have been donated by member countries. I'm wondering whether you could have McKinsey inspire the corporate sector to not to give money, but to lobby relevant countries to meet the needs that the UN has set, because there's no way to have youth who are unemployed, uneducated, simply sitting around, become productive unless there's enough of an investment to build an infrastructure.
Good push. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Want to comment on that?
No, I think it's
agree?
I do, as you were talking, what was going through my mind is I think it's more, it's this issue of the public good, or the commons, if you will. And I think we are in a world, I guess why I'm personally interested is it isn't an issue, these issues aren't things you can just isolate now into a corner of the earth that no matter how you feel, it doesn't affect you. It's affecting all of us. You know, the Syrian refugee crisis could lead to the UK leaving the EU. In a way, it's a driving, you know, the interrelationships of all this going on. So I think it's in the interest of corporates we have to play some role, and I do think it's going to cost more to be able to make this to work. And if we can deal with the earlier part of it, it'll cost us less than if we deal with it when the crisis hits. So I would subscribe to what you're saying, but I think there's something more broad here, which is this is where I think we all have to be involved in some way, or we're all going to pay the price over the long term on it. And we're seeing it, I think, now. And I think more and more businesses, it's more relevant every day, not just because of the news, because it's actually affecting our businesses.
I saw a hand back here, yeah.
Thanks. Rachel Robbins. You've talked a bit about China. Can you talk about other emerging markets? And given the China slowdown, the commodity fall, the currency volatility, there have been a lot of headwinds. Where are you and your clients seeing opportunities in the near future?
It's I like how you're saying it too, because I think emerging markets is almost too broad of a term now, because there are quite a lot of differences. And I think even the BRIC notion, I'm not so sure how relevant that is right now. But if just more to answer your question, I think if take the non-BRICS, I think Indonesia remains a place, even though it's a government that is not very effective right now. They're struggling to be able to get things done. The strange thing is you still have a very strong underlying consumer growth that's going on there. And you look at the auto, retail, financial services, it's a country I would focus and spend time. And it's been fairly consistent over the last 15 years. That's a country we focus on. India, but I wouldn't look at India as a whole. I think you have to look at it in terms of its regions. I think India, even though they've frankly adjusted through accounting the growth rates, it looks higher than it actually is on a comparable basis from before. There are regions in India that are doing very well, and India is a place I think it's a government that's struggling, not because of their intent, but because of the challenges of making change in the place. But I think that is a place that's going to move. So India is a place I look at. Nigeria is also one. Again, I always give the comment. It's not the most straightforward of places, but again, more babies were born in Nigeria this year than all of Europe combined, right? It's a young population. If you're in the diaper business, you better be in Nigeria, or you're not gonna, you know what I mean? It's a place I would be focusing on. East Africa, it's interesting to look at the integration going on between Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and they're trying. There's some attempts with Tanzania. It's not, but if you're even thinking about how do you do railway lines, if you think about it as a region as opposed to countries and so forth, and I think there's a push there. And then, in South America, again, I was going to say Argentina. I worry because it's had 75 years of, a disaster. Will it, move through? But the new leadership, I think, in Argentina, at least from what we see with the activity and work going on, there's some very interesting things going on in Argentina. There are other people here who may have a deeper sense. I know you do, Paul, of where it is. But I think that our hope is that the governance, a lot of these are around governance issues as to whether they work. Those are countries that we'd probably think that where there's some move. One area of the world which I think we're not paying enough attention to in the West a lot is the Silk Road. I think we're way underestimating the investment and the growth that's going to occur. And these are in the areas going from, the western part of China, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. These are areas I think that there's going to be a huge amount of investment being put in by the Chinese. It's interesting, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is also looking at what role they're going to play in terms of investments in those parts of the world. And that's, there's going to be, I think it's something like 81,000 kilometers of railway are going to be built on the Silk Road over the next 7 years. And generally when the Chinese say they're going to build something, they do it, right? But that's with ambitions, and this is maybe getting crazy out there, to have a railway link between Beijing and London that would take 2 days if you had a fast train. But that's the kind of thinking that's out there, but I don't think we're spending a lot of time thinking about it. I couldn't pick a particular country on that Silk Road because I just don't know them enough, but I think it's an area we should look at. Those would be the ones I'd look at.
Well, we're just about out of time, and I think that actually opportunities is a really great note to end on. So I want to thank Dom for being here. I've taken so many notes, so this has been very helpful, and it's been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks to all of you for being here today. Please join me in thanking Dom.
Thank you.